Flatbread. 14,000 years ago, someone in Jordan ground wild wheat between two rocks, mixed it with water, and slapped the resulting paste onto a hot stone. They had no idea if it would kill them. They ate it anyway, because the alternative was starving to death. This happened before agriculture, before civilization, before anyone had the reasonable expectation that intentionally eating cooked grain mush was a good idea. The Natufian culture in the Levant were hunter-gatherers who got so desperate they started experimenting with grass seeds. The process was brutal. Grind grain until your hands bleed. Add water. Cook on rocks, heated by fire. 0 leavening. 0 rise. 100%. Please don't let us die. And it worked well enough that every ancient civilization independently invented the exact same thing. Egypt had it. Mesopotamia had it. The Indus Valley had it. China had it. Suspicious consistency for something that tastes like cardboard. Unleavened bread. Appears in religious texts, specifically because it was the bread for millennia. There was no other option. Here's the uncomfortable part. Flatbread was so successful that it never left. Tortillas, naan, pita, injera, lavash, they're all variations of that first desperate experiment. We spent 10,000 years perfecting bread, and people still choose the original version. Flatbread kept us alive, but humans got bored of not dying and wanted bread that actually tasted good. That's where things got weird. Sourdough. Around 3000 BCE in Egypt, someone left their bread dough out too long. Wild yeast and bacteria colonized it. The dough rose, filled with air pockets, transformed into something unrecognizable. They ate the infected bread anyway. It was better. This was a complete accident. Lactobacillus bacteria created carbon dioxide and that distinctive tangy flavor. The Egyptians had absolutely no idea what yeast was, no concept of microbiology, 0 understanding of fermentation. They just knew that keeping a piece of old dough made the next batch rise, so they kept infected dough in jars and treated it like magic. These starters got passed down like family heirlooms. Some modern sourdough starters are over 200 years old, continuous bacterial colonies maintained across generations. During the San Francisco Gold Rush, miners kept their starters warm by sleeping with them, literally kept jars of fermenting dough in their armpits to prevent freezing. The actual microbiology wasn't understood until the 1800s. For 4,800 years, humans maintained bacterial colonies and had 0 idea why it worked. Modern sourdough costs $9 a loaf and gets marketed as artisanal, when it's literally the oldest, most primitive, leavened bread that exists. We've come full circle to paying premium prices for ancient bacteria. The irony, sourdough's long fermentation breaks down gluten, making it easier to digest. We accidentally engineered better. Bread, then spent 5,000 years engineering it back to being worse. Sourdough required patience and bacterial maintenance. Naturally, humans wanted a shortcut, yeasted bread. Louis Pasteur figured out what yeast actually was in 1857, and within decades, commercial yeast killed sourdough culture. Literally, convenience murdered tradition. For millennia, bakers used beer foam or kept old dough without understanding the mechanism. They just knew it worked. Then Pasteur identified Saccharomyces cerevisiae as the leavening agent, and everything changed. By 1868, commercial yeast production began. The Fleischmann brothers marketed yeast cakes aggressively at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, and baking transformed overnight. Rise time dropped from 12+ hours to 1 or 2 hours. Sourdough bakeries went extinct in most of the world within 50 years. The knowledge of maintaining starters, understanding fermentation cycles, reading dough behavior, gone. Replaced by packets you buy at the store, Wonder Bread launched in 1921 using pure commercial yeast. Soft, uniform, predictable. No complexity, no tang, no character. Just reliable mediocrity. Here's the uncomfortable part. The moment we understood yeast, we industrialized it and erased thousands of years of baking knowledge. Commercial yeast made bread faster, cheaper, and significantly blander. We traded flavor complexity for speed and introduced dependency. Home bakers couldn't bake anymore without buying yeast packets. Wonder Bread marketed itself as scientifically superior because it was made in factories. Untouched by human hands was an actual selling point. We made bread sterile and weird and called it progress. But yeasted bread still required kneading and skill. And humans hate skill requirements when we can engineer them away. Baguette. France's most iconic bread is less than 100 years old and was possibly invented because of a law banning bakers from working before 4 a.m. The baguette is a labor law workaround. Despite the mythology, baguettes aren't ancient. They emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1919, a French law prohibited bakers from starting work before 4 in the morning to improve labor conditions. The problem? Traditional round loaves took too long to bake for breakfast service. The solution was elegant. Same dough, different shape. Long, thin loaves baked much faster. Pair that with Austrian steam oven technology imported to Paris that enabled impossibly crispy crusts, and by the 1920s, baguettes dominated the city. France got so protective of this accidental invention that in 1993, they legally defined what counts as a real baguette. Only 4 ingredients allowed: flour, water, salt, and yeast. Nothing else. They legislated bread purity. The baguette's shape-to-crust ratio created the crust versus crumb debate that still defines bread snobbery today. It introduced the concept that bread could be fashionable. That form mattered as much as function. Here's the weird part. Baguettes go stale in 6 to 8 hours. Parisians buy bread multiple times daily. France designed an entire lifestyle around bread that expires immediately. The baguette proved bread could be an aesthetic choice. Then America industrialized bread into something that never dies: sliced bread. Otto Rohvetter spent 16 years perfecting an automatic bread slicing machine. In 1917, a fire destroyed his prototype and all his blueprints. He rebuilt it from memory. When he finally launched it commercially in 1928 in Chillicothe, Missouri, every baker told him sliced bread would go stale instantly and nobody would buy it. They were right about the staling. Sliced bread did go stale faster. The solution? Chemical preservatives. Problem solved through chemistry? Wonder Bread adopted pre-slicing in 1930 and sales exploded. Within 20 years, the best thing since sliced bread entered the language as the literal benchmark for innovation. We became so dependent on pre-sliced bread that when the U.S. government banned it in 1943 for wartime conservation, public outrage forced them to reverse the decision in 3 months.
So I'm gonna do this right here
12
before we
years.
close out.
That's how long it took for sliced bread to become so essential that banning it caused riots. Here's what nobody mentions. Rohvetter's invention only worked because we normalized adding preservatives to bread. Bread went from lasting hours to lasting weeks. We traded freshness for shelf stability and called it progress. The texture of modern sandwich bread is engineered, not baked. It's designed to be soft, uniform, and compress into basically nothing when you squeeze it. That's not an accident. That's industrial food science. Sliced bread made sandwiches convenient. But some people wanted bread that didn't taste like sweetened foam. Enter the backlash. Whole wheat bread. White bread became so popular in the late 1800s that we milled away all the nutrition, caused disease epidemics, then had to re-engineer the nutrients back in. Whole wheat bread is a reaction to us making bread too well. Ancient bread was whole grain by default because refining technology didn't exist. Then in the 1870s, steel roller mills enabled cheap white flour production, and white bread became a status symbol. Poor people ate dark bread. Rich people ate white. By the early 1900s, beriberi and pellagra outbreaks started appearing. Turns out removing the bran and germ also removed vitamins. The solution in the 1940s? Government-mandated enrichment, literally adding back synthetic versions of the nutrients we deliberately removed. Sylvester Graham in 1829 and John Harvey Kellogg promoted whole wheat for health reasons, but nobody listened until the counterculture movement of the 1960s and 70s revived it as virtuous eating. Here's the dark part. Most commercial whole wheat bread isn't actually 100% whole grain. It contains added sugars to mask the bitter flavor of bran, and some brands use caramel coloring to look healthier than they are. We reversed the status symbol. White bread was luxury. Then science proved it was worse, so now whole wheat costs more. We're paying a premium for the thing we used to throw away. But whole wheat still had gluten, and we were about to make that everyone's problem. Gluten-free bread. Celiac disease affects roughly 1% of the population. Somehow, by 2013, 30% of Americans were trying to avoid gluten. The gluten-free market hit $5 billion because we turned a protein into a villain. Celiac disease was identified in the 1940s as a genuine autoimmune disorder where gluten triggers intestinal damage. For decades, gluten-free meant rice cakes and misery. Then in 2011, a book called Wheat Belly blamed gluten for obesity, brain fog, and basically every health problem imaginable. Gluten sensitivity became mainstream despite weak scientific evidence. The BI market exploded. By 2015, gluten-free products were everywhere. Crackers, cookies, pasta, and bread that cost 2 to 3 times regular bread. Early gluten-free bread was catastrophically bad. Crumbly, dry, with the texture of compressed cardboard. Making bread without gluten required xanthan gum, rice flour, tapioca starch, and aggressive processing. We removed one protein and replaced it with a dozen chemical binders. Modern versions improved, but here's the absurd part. Gluten-free bread requires more processing and additives than regular bread. We engineered out gluten to make bread healthier, then compensated with heavy industrial manipulation. The fad created genuine benefits for celiacs who finally had options. But it also normalized treating food like medicine and proteins like toxins. Many people avoiding gluten had no idea what gluten actually was. They just knew bread was bad now. We engineered gluten out of bread. Then we decided bread itself was the problem. Keto bread. We've been eating bread for 14,000 years. Then, around 2018, we decided carbohydrates were poison and started making bread from almond flour, psyllium husk, and desperation. It's bread that denies being bread. The ketogenic diet started in the 1920s as an epilepsy treatment, resurfaced with Atkins in the 1970s, then went mainstream in the 2010s. By 2020, the keto market was worth $9.7 billion, and everyone was blaming carbs for everything wrong in their lives. Keto bread contains almond flour, coconut flour, eggs, fiber supplements, and xanthan gum. Zero resemblance to actual bread in texture, taste, or molecular structure. It often has more calories than regular bread, despite being marketed as diet food. The psychological warfare is calling it guilt-free, while charging $8 to $10 per loaf. Here's the ultimate irony. Many keto bread brands use wheat gluten as the primary binding agent. The same gluten we spent the previous decade demonizing is now a health ingredient because it's protein, not carbohydrate. We've reached the end point. Bread with no grain, using gluten for structure, designed to replace bread while fundamentally not being bread. We started with grain and water in Jordan 14,000 years ago. We've arrived at almond flour and xanthan gum shaped like bread. We spent millennia perfecting bread, then 1 decade deconstructing it into something unrecognizable. Welcome to the weird part of bread history, where we are right now.